Did you know that in Victorian England, opium was sold in pharmacies as a common remedy? Mothers gave laudanum to babies to help them sleep. But opium dens were a different story. Concentrated in London's port neighborhoods like Limehouse, they were frequented by sailors and workers. The press exaggerated things to sell newspapers, creating myths that still last to this day. I'm going to show you 20 real facts about this, with no romanticizing and no manufactured fear. Subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. In Victorian-era London, the first opium dens showed up in the 1850s. Chinese sailors working in the East End docks brought the habit into Limehouse's dark alleyways. The ironic part is that England itself had made billions selling opium to China, but acted scandalized when the drug showed up on its own soil. Writers like Charles Dickens visited these places to research their novels, and the police often looked the other way, since many customers were respectable upper-class gentlemen trying to escape the era's strict moral rules. You've probably heard of London's Chinatown, right? Well, the Victorian version was very different from what the press at the time wanted you to believe. Limehouse had only a few hundred Chinese people, not thousands like the sensational newspapers claimed. Most were sailors who worked on the docks of the Thames. The tabloids whipped up a panic about opium and crime that just didn't match reality. Writers like Oscar Wilde and Charles Dickens used the neighborhood as a dark setting in their works, feeding the stereotypes even more. The real community was made up of ordinary working people trying to get by far from home. Most of the people who hung out in those places weren't English. They were Chinese sailors and lascars, ship workers coming from Asia, who had picked up the habit during long trips through the East. The press at the time loved to play it up, portraying these places as dens of vice where respectable Britons ruined themselves. The reality was different. These establishments mainly served an immigrant community that lived around the docks. The strange thing is that the British Empire itself made billions selling opium to China, but acted horrified when the product showed up in its own backyard. Ah Sing's opium den in Limehouse was the most famous in London. It was in a damp basement where sailors and aristocrats shared the same smoky room. The Victorian elite went there out of curiosity, wanting to see that forbidden world up close. They say Charles Dickens visited the place to research his novels. Conan Doyle is said to have done the same before creating Sherlock Holmes. No one knows if they actually smoked, but the fact that they went there shows how opium fascinated every social class. The owner, Ah Sing, became a kind of dark celebrity in London at the time. In 1868, the French newspaper Figaro sent reporters into the back alleys of London. What they found shocked readers in Paris. Unventilated basements where Chinese people, Indian sailors, and disreputable Englishmen shared filthy mattresses on the floor. The smoke was so thick you could barely see. These places ran 24 hours a day. For a few pennies, anyone could go in, smoke, and forget about life outside. The police knew but looked the other way. After all, opium was legal in the British Empire, which made fortunes selling the drug in China. The hypocrisy was glaring. London condemned the vices of Easterners while its own citizens rotted in these holes. The owners were usually Chinese men who had worked on ships and ended up stuck in England, unable to get back home. Limehouse, 1870. On a single street in that neighborhood, there were up to 9 opium dens operating side by side. Sounds like a lot, right? But here's the detail nobody mentions. That was the exception, not the rule. All of London probably had fewer than 20 of those places. The press at the time loved to exaggerate, creating the image of a city overrun by addiction. The reality? Limehouse was a port where Chinese sailors stopped between voyages. They brought the habit, opened small places, and served basically one another. The moral panic came later, when writers like Dickens visited the area and turned simple alleys into nightmare settings. Forget everything Hollywood showed you about a Victorian London packed with opium dens on every corner. In 1911, when the City Council finally did a serious survey, they found only 22 places where opium was smoked. And get this, almost all of them were private homes of Chinese immigrants, not those creepy spots the sensational newspapers loved to describe. Reality was very different from the hysteria. Most Brits who used opium bought laudanum at the neighborhood pharmacy. legal and cheap. The tabloids cooked up a fantasy of Oriental danger that made headlines for decades, but the numbers tell a different story. In the Victorian era, smoking opium became practically a ritual. The person would lie on their side, hold a long pipe, and heat the drug over an oil lamp. The whole process took hours. It wasn't like having a quick drink after work. It was an experience that took up the entire night. The smoker would slip into a trance, half awake, half asleep, completely disconnected from the world. The British imported tons of this substance from India and even fought 2 wars to force China to buy the product. That's right, the British Empire went to war to secure the trade in narcotics. And the strangest part, while they were flooding Asia with opium, the English began to see the addiction spreading in their own cities. In Victorian England, doctors prescribed opium the way people hand out aspirin today. You'd take it and feel this wave of well-being that seemed to fix everything. But then the other side of it hit. First came this heavy drowsiness that could knock anyone out. Then your stomach would turn upside down with constant nausea. The constipation was so severe that a lot of people ended up with chronic intestinal problems. And there was something nobody talked about in the doctor's office: the dreams. Visions so real that people woke up not knowing if they were asleep or awake. Some described scenes that felt like messages from another world. The most unsettling part? Millions of Victorians thought those symptoms were a fair price to pay for a brief break from pain. In the Victorian era, English doctors noticed something unsettling. Chinese immigrants in London's ports became addicted much faster than middle-class ladies who drank laudanum for pain. The difference was in the delivery. When smoked, opium hit the brain in seconds, creating a rush of pleasure that was impossible to forget. Drunk as laudanum, absorption was slow and the effect was gradual. The body had time to adjust. Smokers developed tolerance and severe withdrawal within weeks. Laudanum users could go for years without realizing they were hooked. This discovery helped science understand that how fast a drug reaches the brain determines how powerful the addiction is. Opium smokers weren't who you'd imagine. Most came from the streets of London: unemployed workers, prostitutes, petty criminals, people with nothing to lose. For them, opium was the only way to escape a brutal reality. They lived in tenements with no running water, worked 16 hours a day when they could find work, and many didn't know if they'd have anything to eat tomorrow. The dens were in the poorest neighborhoods, especially in Limehouse, near the docks. There, for a few pennies, anyone could forget hunger and the cold for a few hours. It was cheap, easy to get, and didn't ask questions. The irony? The same empire that made billions selling opium in China watched its own poorest citizens sink into the very same substance. A London elite had their own hideaways, hidden, low-key, but real. Some places offered comfy couches, top-shelf imported opium, and Chinese attendants who knew the Eastern rituals. Aristocrats, doctors, and even politicians went to these spots, always through the back door. Hypocrisy was the real luxury of the time. By day, these men condemned vice in public speeches. By night, they vanished into the shadows of Limehouse. But don't be fooled. Those elegant houses were rare exceptions. Most smokers wasted away in filthy holes with zero glamour. Did you know Dickens personally visited London's opium dens before writing about them? In 1870, he published The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his last novel, which starts in one of those places. The owner in the story, known as Princess Puffer, was a wrinkled old woman who prepared the pipes for her customers. Dickens based her on real people he met in the Limehouse neighborhood. The book was never finished because the author died of a stroke at 58, leaving the mystery unsolved. Even so, the work helped create in the Victorian mind the image of dens as dangerous, seedy places, a view that shaped laws and prejudices for decades. Arthur Conan Doyle knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote The Man with the Twisted Lip in 1891. Sherlock Holmes investigating a case involving an opium den that sold newspapers and magazines like crazy. Reality was more complicated. Those places did exist in London, yes, but not in the dramatic way fiction portrayed them. They were usually small, filthy rooms in the East End, frequented mostly by Chinese immigrants and a few sailors. The Victorian middle class was fascinated and horrified at the same time. Conan Doyle, trained as a doctor, knew the effects of opium from clinical practice. He turned that knowledge into entertainment that fed the fears and curiosity of the era. The Victorian press loved a scandalous headline. Newspapers portrayed London as the European capital of opium, a den of depravity and vice. But here's the detail editors forgot to mention. Paris had more opium dens than London. Historians who dug through records from the time found that the story was more sensationalism than reality. London had maybe a dozen establishments concentrated in Limehouse near the docks. Paris, with its community of artists and writers, easily topped that number. So why did London get the reputation? Simple. It sold newspapers. The Victorian public wanted stories of Eastern decadence and exotic danger, and Fleet Street delivered exactly that. Did you know Queen Victoria ran the biggest drug cartel in history? That's not an exaggeration. The East India Company grew opium in India and shipped tons of it to China, all legalized and blessed by the Crown. The reason was simple. The British bought tea, silk, and porcelain from the Chinese, but they didn't have anything the Chinese wanted in return. The result? A massive hole in the empire's finances. The solution they found was to get millions of Chinese people addicted to opium. When China tried to block it from coming in, England declared war twice to keep the trade going. Profit above everything, even if it cost the health of an entire country. Tinctures like laudanum were sold freely in pharmacies and grocery stores. Mothers gave drops to soothe crying babies. Workers used it to get through body aches. The middle class took it to sleep better. The quiet addiction grew in respectable homes while the British government made billions by forcing China to buy the drug during the Opium Wars. The hypocrisy was glaring. They condemned Chinese opium smokers, but ignored their own wives and children hooked on little bottles sold on the corner. Different from other drugs, dying from smoking opium in a single hit was rare. The body absorbs the smoke little by little, so overdose wasn't the real problem. The danger was in the long run. The addict would waste away without even noticing. First came the loss of appetite. Then teeth started to fall out. The skin took on a sickly yellow tint. The owners of the dens saw this happen over and over. Customers who showed up healthy came back weeks later unrecognizable. Many stopped working, spent everything they had, and simply disappeared. It was death in slow motion. And worst of all, the smoker was usually too relaxed to care. In the 1870s, a wave of panic swept through cities on the West Coast. Chinese workers who came to build the railroads brought with them the habit of smoking opium. The problem? The economy was bad, and white Americans needed someone to blame. Politicians and newspapers started spreading scary stories about opium dens, where supposedly white women were being seduced by Chinese men. In most cases, it was a lie, but it worked. San Francisco passed the country's first anti-opium law in 1875, aimed specifically at the Chinese. What's ironic is that white doctors kept prescribing opium freely to their high society female patients. The drug itself wasn't the real problem, it was who was using it. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. London had dozens of dens, houses where anyone could walk in, pay a few pennies, and spend hours smoking. The substance was legal and sold in pharmacies without a prescription. Doctors prescribed it for toothaches, baby colic, and even sadness. Queen Victoria used a mixture with opium for menstrual cramps, but the government started cracking down. In 1868, the Pharmacy Act limited who could sell it. In the following decades, the restrictions increased. The dens closed down one by one. The practice disappeared from the streets, but writers like Dickens and Conan Doyle had already captured these scenes in their books, creating a myth that still lasts today. In the Victorian era, opium was sold freely in pharmacies. Syrups containing the drug were even given to babies to calm colic. The result? Thousands of accidental overdose deaths at home, not in dark dens. The real danger was in the kitchen cabinet, not out on the streets. Which fact surprised you the most? Comment below. If you want more no-frills historical breakdowns, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.